this afternoon. Our three panelists, our three presenters, in the order in which they are going to present, are Andrew Caton. Drew Caton is Distinguished Professor of History at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He's written extensively about United States expansion into the Mississippi and Ohio valleys in the 18th and early 19th century. He's co-author with Fred Anderson of The Dominion of War, Empire and Liberty in North America, 1500 to 2000, the paperback edition of which will be published in November. Our second speaker will be Richard Gamble, who is Associate Professor of History at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's been there since 1994 and teaches in the honors program. He is the author of The War for Righteousness, Progressive Christianity, The Great War, and the Rise of the Messianic Nation. Our third speaker is Bradley J. Burtzer, who is Russell Amos Kirk Professor in History and Director of the American Studies Program at Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and his PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Burtzer is the author of J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth, 2003. He's the co-editor of The American Democrat and Other Political Writings by James Fenimore Cooper, published in 2000, and the co-author of The American West, published in 2002. So that's our lineup for this afternoon, and Drew Caton will start us off.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say how happy I am to be here. Thank you very much to Gleaves for the invitation, and to Kathy and Brian and all the other people I haven't yet met who have made this possible and made it run so efficiently. I want to talk to you a little bit this afternoon, and I will try to keep my comments as short as possible, although my students saying, a professor saying you're going to be brief is like a dentist saying don't worry, it won't hurt. But I want to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the very exciting and problematic nature of thinking of United States history as world history. One of the developments, I think, among academic historians over the last few years, particularly the last decade, and we've heard some of this morning, has been an increasing interest in locating the history of North America and the history of our republic in larger patterns in the history of the world. The problem with this, or one of the difficulties with this, is it involves what we might call cross-cultural history, or what we would call cross-cultural history. And that's extremely difficult and extremely dangerous, because on one level it means that we're trying to understand other people and to try and think about the ways in which other people think about us, as well as simply studying other parts of the world to see where the United States goes diplomatically, or to think about our self-identity by talking about what we think about other people. And I want to start with a little anecdote, which I think goes to the heart of the problem I'm talking about. This actually comes from the 1840s. And it's an anecdote about a man whom I absolutely love. His name was John Lloyd Stephens. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of John Lloyd Stephens. John Lloyd Stephens was from New York, and he was an attorney, and he became a very successful explorer, kind of an early amateur anthropologist. And he traveled in Mexico, he traveled in Central America, he traveled in the Holy Land, as it was called, investigating ruins and ancient civilizations. And then he published narratives of these trips, which became bestsellers in the United States. Tens of thousands of Americans read what John Stephens had to say. Now, John Stephens was kind of a typical sort of celebrating of an individual, entrepreneurial kind of activity in the early 19th century. He also loved these ancient civilizations in part because he was curious about what happened to them. And like many Americans in the 19th century, he was worried about the future of the United States as well, too. But the anecdote in particular I want to talk about is that in 1847, he was in Prussia, and he thought his dreams had come true. He was finally going to meet Alexander von Humboldt, who was still alive, believe it or not, in 1847, 78 years old, the Enlightenment scientist and explorer who had spent a lot of time in Mexico and had published famous accounts of that, volume after volume after volume. And Stephens was granted an hour's audience at Potsdam in 1847. And he spent days preparing for this because they were going to talk about the Mayans and get there. Well, when he arrived, von Humboldt and met him. Stevens said, exchanged greetings. And Stevens said something about the Mayans, and Humboldt said, I don't want to talk about the Mayans. What are you doing in Mexico? And Stevens was taken aback by the fact that von Humboldt spent the next hour quizzing him down about the United States war with Mexico, about which he seemed to be extremely well informed. And Stevens later remarked, besides his disappointment at not being able to share, he said, this war is producing everywhere a strong impression of our ability for war, which in enlightened Europe, even in this day, more than all the fruits of peace, industry, and extended commerce, more than the exhibition of 20 million people abounding in all the comforts of life, raises us to the rank of a first-rate power and makes us, quote, respected. Now, there's a kind of sarcasm in what Stevens is talking about, but there's also frustration, because he doesn't quite understand exactly what is going on. Why von Humboldt, this man whom he'd spent his life admiring so much, would say that what really matters in some ways about the United States to him in the middle of 1847 is the fact that the United States seems to be doing very well at war. On many levels, this little story tells us some of the ways in which thinking about US history as world history can be problematic. For one thing, in order to understand this, you've got to understand von Humboldt, and you have to understand the history of Prussia, and you have to learn how to speak German on some level. It is extremely difficult, in other words, to understand the context in which other people think about the United States without understanding the context in which they actually live. The advantage, however, of looking at it is that you see yourself, or think about seeing yourself and your nation, through the eyes of other people. And when you do that, sometimes you're surprised and flummoxed and just filled with consternation, as Stevens was. What exactly is going on here? And how could somebody think of us in these ways? And Americans today, and we've heard it today, and we do it all the time, will say, well, the United States didn't have an army. There weren't that many people in the army, a couple thousand here and there, 20,000 a little bit later. The United States is not a military nation, particularly. American soldiers are citizen soldiers. And so how could the rest of the world, not just von Humboldt, but other people, begin to think in this way? Stevens had been frustrated earlier in San Salvador in 1840 when he met a group of people who came up to him and said, talked to him about Texans, and said Texas was eventually going to be annexed by the United States. This is in 1840, and said, they considered us as bent upon the conquest of Mexico, and of course Guatemala would come next. The odium of our ambitious pretensions increased the feeling of coldness and distrust he encountered everywhere. In other words, what Stevens is seeing everywhere he goes is that people are seeing him as a representative of a people who are militaristic and a people who are engaged in conquest. Now, what you see going on here, I think, and what also makes it difficult to talk about, is that you're ending up with conflicting kinds of stories. And one of the ways in which we talk about identity and talk about what we are and who we are is not simply what we do in battle and not simply what we do when we sign treaties and international relations and so on, but the kind of stories we tell ourselves. And one of the things that's very important about the turn of the 20th century is that in the American story, much long after John Stevens was dead, that is a critical turning point in American history. It is a turning point, as we've heard already today, in which the United States suddenly became international. And the reason I think we think in those terms is primarily because we limit ourselves to thinking in terms of diplomatic history. We look at treaties, we look at what secretaries of state do, we look at what the military does and the Navy does, without thinking in larger cultural terms about individual citizens and the way in which those citizens were perceived. What you get, developing in the early 20th century and enormously popular in the United States then, is a history of the United States which emphasizes that the United States was a fairly isolated nation in the 19th century that suddenly emerged into the 20th century as an international power and a world leader. Initially, this, of course, is all for the good, because one of the things that Americans like to stress in that story is that this is a very different kind of empire. It is an empire, as we've heard before, that liberates, that frees other people, that does not try and get territory or incorporate other peoples. Yet, at the same time, we find that in the 20th century, and I think this is one of the glories of the United States, is that this story is challenged all the time. You get a challenge from economic historians who want to argue that, in fact, what this was really about was not so much a change in political parties or politics or ideology, as it was a simple recognition of the fact that it is between 1880 and 1900 that the United States passes Great Britain to become the greatest manufacturer in the world. In 1880, the United States produced 14.7% of the world's manufactured goods. In 1900, the United States manufactured 23.6% of the world's goods, passing Great Britain and Germany a little bit behind it. More recently, we have criticized this overall story about the importance of 1898 in cultural terms and racial terms, looking at the ways in which the expansion of the United States also changed because white Americans fundamentally did not want to incorporate people of different religions and different races into the United States, particularly at a time when Jim Crow laws were becoming much, much more popular in the American South, and when European and Asian immigrants were flooding into the United States in ways that were scaring many white middle-class Americans to death. So I think what happens, and you can look at this story, and one of the great things about this story is the extent to which then it's a story of triumph that is challenged constantly by other Americans, and a kind of debate about what the United States is and what kind of country it is internationally. I would argue, however, that one of the things we're going to have to do, whether we like it or not, in the 21st century, is to stop simply seeing the United States, the history of the United States, from the inside out. That is, whether we come to celebrate the United States or to flail the United States, or more importantly, to see the United States as a nation, which, like a person, is made up of all kinds of good things and bad things and problems and successes as well, but to think about the United States in terms of the ways in which other peoples, and not simply other policymakers and other nations, see it. To do that, I think, we'll add some different kinds of questions to our story, and I want to spend the last couple of minutes I have here not giving you answers, but raising some questions that I think come out of this, and ways in which we might begin to think differently about our history in a larger sense. One thing I think it makes us think about is the difference between intentions and consequences. And I think that's something that American historians haven't spent a lot of time talking about. We may say we do all the things that we do for good and noble reasons, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll receive them. They will be received in that way. For example, it's very nice to say that the United States did not have a standing army of any size in the 19th century, but that didn't make a whole lot of difference to American Indians or to Mexicans or to people in Canada who felt themselves completely destroyed. It didn't make much difference to white Southerners either. One of the great things about E.L. Doctorow's new book, The March, the novel, is the way in which he gives you that sense of the enormous power of the United States and the way in which it makes things different for people. So I think one of the things then we have to separate is the difference between our story and the fact that there are other competing stories that talk about in different ways. A second way I think it makes us think differently is to think about our history as a variation on a global theme. That is, the United States of America was not the only nation-state created in the 18th century and the 19th century. It is not the only nation-state wrestling with problems of rebellion and resistance and liberalism and capitalism and everything else. The American Civil War is only one, and particularly deadly, example of literally dozens of internal conflicts that are happening all over Europe, Asia, and Latin America in the 19th century. To think of the United States then as a variation on a theme is not to argue against American exceptionalism necessarily, but to say that the United States is a unique variation on a theme that is going on all over the world. It also, for example, helps us understand things like the Caribbean. Cuba, for example. What's going on in Cuba is not simply sort of little episodes, but a struggle that's been going on for centuries over control of the Caribbean basin and the Gulf of Mexico. And that moves not just between nation states, but different forms of imperialism, from kind of companies that work on behalf of governments, to individual filibusters, to nation states, to finally global corporations in the 20th century. And so by focusing solely on American policy, we miss the complexity of that kind of imperialism. Another thing that makes us think differently about, or a question I would raise, is periodization. For example, I think if you begin to look at the United States the way von Humboldt was looking at the United States, that you might say the United States actually emerged as a major international player in the middle of the 19th century and not at the end of it. That it was the American Civil War and the war with Mexico that persuaded people all over the world that the United States was a serious player that had to be dealt with in some way or another. U.S. Grant, for example, doesn't go to Prussia alone. He goes all over the world, and people know who he is all over the world. And they understand him in the context of their own domestic internal problems, many of which resolve around the question of asking Grant, how did you do it? How did you kill 600,000 people, change the attitudes and behavior of some of your citizens, and yet bring your country back together again? That's a question that is of enormous interest to Chancellor Bismarck, to Alexander II in Russia, to the Emperor Meiji in Japan, and it's not necessarily intrinsic to the United States. It's the larger question of national and state interest in the 19th century. One more, and that's colonialism and imperialism, and ways in which we might think about it in other people's eyes. I think one of the problems that many Americans have when you start talking about looking at American history as world history and saying, well, what do other people think of us, is you're going to get a negative connotation. They're going to see us all as nasty brutes coming out to get them, and so on. I'm not sure that's always the case. I think people in the 19th century and many people in the early 20th century, and quite frankly, people today, have very ambivalent feelings about the United States as an imperial power. One of the things about the 19th century, for example, is that many people saw the United States as an imperial colonial power. That is, the United States was not simply advancing in the world, the United States was the model of a colonial nation that escaped from Great Britain. And many people in Asia and Latin America and other parts of the world look upon the United States as an ally in fighting Great Britain and other European powers. In this sense, for example, we get a whole different sense of our relationship between Great Britain and the United States, which is not solely about what we inherit from Great Britain and the notion that after 1815 we're pals with Great Britain, but the way in which Great Britain is the great rival of the United States well into the 20th century, and other people think in those ways. So that the United States is as attractive as an empire to certain people because it is a counterbalance to the existing hegemon economically, militarily, and diplomatic, which is the British. So in these ways, I mean, what I'm trying to do here is to suggest to you that we have, I think, as historians and scholars, an enormous difficulty and challenge facing us in the 21st century, because we're being globalized whether we like it or not. One of the things we have to think about is whether the nation state itself, something that really came into its own in the 18th century and flourished in the 19th century, 100 years from now, will be something that will be talked about in very anachronistic terms, or certainly very differently. So what we have to do, I think, then, is ask different kinds of questions and think in different kinds of ways and break out of our obsession with talking about ourselves all the time and start to try and find ways, as difficult as they are, to engage not only in international history, but in international conversation, and to see United States history and our interest in other people not as simply another episodes in which we can understand ourselves better, but to understand the United States as a particularly important and exciting variation on the ways in which human beings all over this planet have attempted to form governments, to establish principles, and to share those values with their fellows all over the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're on. This is easy.
Let me add my thanks for the invitation to speak today, and also for the splendid organization that has gone on behind the scenes for this conference. My paper builds off in a nice way from Drew's presentation, because I'm going to look at America through the eyes of an outsider. And yet this outsider reinforces Americans' most exaggerated views of themselves. So I'm not sure it quite achieves what Drew would like it to achieve, but I hope you find it interesting. If you had been alive in 1901, would you have greeted the new century with hope or fear? Philosophical optimists and pessimists imagined a future of extremes. Was Western humanity on the threshold of a secular millennium of enlightenment and civilization, or on the brink of spiritual and cultural catastrophe? By measures of material wealth, power, and technological innovation, there was every reason for optimism. The sparkling Paris Exposition of 1900 had displayed the technological wonders of the age, especially the marvelous applications of electricity. But the mood was also somber. Queen Victoria died on January 22, 1901, after a remarkable reign of nearly 64 years. An unpredictable Kaiser Wilhelm II ruled a rising Germany, unified only 30 years before. The elderly Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, still grieved over his wife's assassination in 1898 by an Italian anarchist. Nicholas II was Tsar of Russia. His grandfather, Alexander II, had been killed by a terrorist bomb. American President William McKinley died on September 14th, struck down by an anarchist bullet in Buffalo, New York. The whirlwind Teddy Roosevelt now occupied the White House. Just 3 years ago, the United States had startled the world by gobbling up the last bits of Spain's once vast global empire. America's bloody war to subdue the Philippines was still underway. Europe pondered why the American Republic had taken the plunge. Just what did this departure and transformation portend for America's precarious balance of power? Did America grasp an overseas empire for resources, for security, for power, for prestige? Europe also buzzed about the menace at home of militarism and armaments. A whole literary genre of future wars filled the bookstalls. Sensationalist fiction and nonfiction titles predicting likely wars between Britain and France, or more presciently between Germany and France. Into this nervous world, British journalist William T. Stead launched his best-selling book, The Americanization of the World, subtitled The Trend of the 20th Century, his prediction of America's inevitable, indeed providential, military, economic, cultural, and ideological domination of the world. Stead, a tireless champion of Anglo-Saxon expansion, offered his prediction not in fear, but in hope. Together, the United States and Britain would rule the world. According to historian John Lukács, Stead's Americanization of the world was, quote, the most direct and eloquent proposition of a union of the English-speaking nations. He captured what people were thinking. Few in 1901 would have confused Stead with a philosopher or political theorist or historian or professional diplomat or theologian. He dabbled in all of these fields, but was first and foremost a journalist, a founder of what Matthew Arnold scorned as the new journalism, and a crusader for every imaginable cause and a few unimaginable. A century ago, Stead's name was known to the public on both sides of the Atlantic and to every prominent official in Europe and America. He was read with attention and respect by many, with bemused tolerance by others. This outsider's vision of America's redemptive empire reveals the odd mix of ideals and policies that comprised at least part of America's self-understanding and image in the world circa 1901, long before anyone experienced firsthand what the American century would be like. Stead was born in 1849, the year that Robert Louis Stevenson was born, poet laureate William Wordsworth died, and Melville's Moby Dick was published. Stead's father was a Congregationalist minister in a small town on the River Tyne in northern England. The stamp of nonconformist Protestantism remained impressed on Stead the rest of his life, even as his dissenting spirit took him further and further from Orthodox Christianity. He was educated by his father and then sent to a boys' school for 2 years. The students' history and geography lessons featured the military campaigns of the American Civil War, then underway. Stead experienced a religious conversion during an evangelical revival that swept his school, and he joined the Congregational Church. Of the Congregationalists, Stead later remarked that they were, quote, the heirs of Cromwell and Milton and the Pilgrim Fathers, and the representatives of the extreme democracy which knows neither male nor female, and which makes the votes of the whole church the supreme and only authority in the church," end quote. Stead's revolutionary zeal and fusion of Christianity and social democracy ran deep in his heritage. By his own account, Stead's mind was shaped by the books of his childhood. As a youth, he read Fox's Book of Martyrs and the poems of James Russell Lowell. He credited the American Civil War poet as the source of his passion for expansive service to humanity. His imagination was also fired by theologian Jonathan Edwards, by the Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, the liberal American evangelical preacher Henry Ward Beecher, Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, Charles Spurgeon, the Bible, Shakespeare, and the historian Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle's Life of Cromwell was a particular favorite, and the Puritan revolutionary held a lifelong fascination for Stead. G.K. Chesterton, who knew Stead, said that he kept one of Cromwell's pistols in his editorial office. In 1899, Stead wrote the following tribute to Cromwell with all the fervor of an evangelical conversion testimony. "The memory of Cromwell has from my earliest boyhood been the inspiration of my life. My devotion to the apostles and the evangelists was but tepid compared with my veneration and affection for the uncrowned king of English Puritanism. Nay, I can to this day remember the serious searchings of heart I experienced when I woke up to a consciousness of the fact that I felt a far keener and more passionate personal love for Oliver Cromwell than I did even for the divine figure of Jesus of Nazareth. Cromwell was so near, so human, and so real. The execution of the man of blood, that is King Charles I, made the 30th of January a red letter day in my calendar, and to this day I feel a thrill of gratitude and pride whenever I pass the banqueting house at Whitehall." The banqueting house in London, a Jacobean monument to divine right monarchy, was, of course, the site of Charles I's execution. In 1901, Stead claimed, without specifying further, that Cromwell, quote, "was instinct with the conviction of the reality of the providential mission of the English-speaking race." While still a young man, Stead became a warrior for social justice as writer and editor for the Northern Echo, the Pall Mall Gazette, and the Review of Reviews, and other lesser-known and meteoric publishing ventures. One person aptly characterized him in 1885 as a mixture of Don Quixote and P.T. Barnum. He publicized such social evils as prostitution and alcohol abuse and demanded legislative action to ameliorate the condition of the common man. He turned the Pall Mall Gazette into a pro-imperial voice and an advocate of expanded imperial federation. The magazine's platform included, quote, "the building up of new empires beyond the sea, the peopling of waste and savage continents with men of our speech and lineage, and the knitting of the world-sundered members of the English realm into one fraternal union," end quote. Stead defended what he called a true imperialism, aimed at the peace, security, unity, and humanitarian uplift of the world. In 1884, he wrote an article for the Pall Mall Gazette entitled "The Truth About the Navy," provoking enough public alarm over Britain's vulnerability and Germany's growing navy and colonial adventures to get Parliament to appropriate the necessary funds for a modern navy. At the same time, he proposed to bring the United States into an Anglo-Saxon union, reversing the blunder of George III, an idea more famously promoted by Stead's friend Cecil Rhodes, who wanted to paint the map red with Britain's empire. Along with his bold naval program and ideology of racial superiority, and without conscious inconsistency or hypocrisy, Stead also saw himself as a principled anti-militarist and an advocate of world peace. Indeed, he devoted much of his booming energy to arbitration projects like the Hague Conference and to various disarmament proposals. He saw no inconsistency between a powerful Britain within an expanding Anglo-Saxon federation, armed with a navy second to none, and the achievement of world peace. The future had to be made secure by an armed peace. The soldier, he said, would be replaced by the international policeman. An active interventionist, he advocated a concert of European power wielded on behalf of security, and at times exercised to liberate subject peoples, such as Bulgaria, from the Turks. He distinguished between two kinds of imperialism. On the one hand, an imperialism of responsibility, which he defined quaintly as, quote, an imperialism plus common sense and the 10 Commandments. Not entirely sure what that means. And on the other hand, a raw jingoism, the imperialism of pride and avarice. Imperialism in the hands of good and wise and powerful people was a blessing to the world. In the spirit of Kipling, but without the poet's gifts of irony, ambiguity, and subtlety, Stead acknowledged imperialism as a burden of service and a benevolent agent of progress, civilization, and humanity. Listen to Stead in 1880 regarding Britain's mission, quote, to maintain the European concert, that germ of the United States of Europe, against isolated inaction, to establish a Roman peace among the dark-skinned races of Asia, Polynesia, and Africa, to unite all branches of the English-speaking race in an Anglo-Saxon Bund, to spread liberty, civilization, and Christianity throughout the world, end quote. By the time Stead came to write The Americanization of the World in 1901, he had already devoted a book 3 years earlier to the prospect of a United States of Europe. Stead wrote in the afterglow of Tsar Nicholas II's call in 1898 for an international peace conference at The Hague, Netherlands, and in the stir caused by the United States' victory over Spain that same year. Stead toured Europe to promote arbitration and even met with Tsar Nicholas himself. He considered the Tsar's holy war against war, as he called it, to be sincere, thoughtful, workable, and necessary. He saw the United States as a model of successful federation that maintained peace and unity without militarism, despite the messy interruption of the Civil War that had served only to strengthen America. In its role as active peacemaker, the United States, he hoped, would even end Ottoman misrule and fly the Stars and Stripes over Istanbul after a quick replay of its victory over Spain. His exuberant praise for the famous Hague Conference mimicked Tennyson's poem In Memoriam, quote, and now this far-off, unseen event toward which the whole continent has been moving with slow but resistless march has come within the pale of practical politics, and on the threshold of the 20th century, we await this latest and greatest new birth of time, capital T, time. Once across that threshold of the new century, Stead turned more insistently to the United States as the inevitable leader in Anglo-Saxon dominance. The 20th century, he predicted correctly, would belong to the United States, but its success meant in truth the triumph of British culture. America was a reincarnated Britain. America's success was really Britain's success. The combined English-speaking world would be formidable indeed. It would unite a massive population, dominate the seas, control the world's resources, and expand in wealth, commerce, and technology. In the age of rational and efficient business trusts, he asked, why couldn't an imperial J.P. Morgan organize the greatest combination of all? At one level, the process of the world's Americanization took the form of the domestic cultural assimilation of countless immigrants to the U.S. While Stead acknowledged this fact and noted the contribution of energetic immigrants to America's dynamism, he was more interested in the process of the external Americanization of the rest of the world. Given the determinism of history, Britain and Europe could either cooperate with inevitable change or wage a losing battle and end up Americanized against their will. Germany and the papacy seemed the most resistant to the Americanization of Europe, but the Kaiser's bluster was as pointless as Canute's command to the tide, and the papacy's skepticism and objections would be overcome. Quote, the Supreme Pontiff will recognize that the principles of Americanism are part and parcel of the sacred deposit of truth, which it is the duty of the Church sedulously to preserve and to disseminate among the nations of the earth," end quote. Europe will be revolutionized by American principles, whether it wants to be or not. And America's revolutionary principles were those of Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, the Puritans, and the Mayflower. The Islamic Ottoman Empire, too, would be regenerated and transformed by the leaven of, quote, "the Declaration of Independence and the fundamental doctrines of the American Constitution," end quote. From the day of its exodus from Europe, America had been a dissolvent of old world ideas. That a British observer of America like Stead could hold to such an exaggerated view of America's providential mission is a reminder that to some degree the American identity has been formed by outsiders. One of Shakespeare's characters, a clown in fact, says that, quote, "some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrown upon them." America's world redemptive identity is a product of all three. It was part of our birth, it has been achieved over time, and it has been thrown upon us by foreign observers, both admirers and critics. This pattern reaches back to English radicals like Richard Price and to French philosophes like Turgot. Even H.G. Wells' plan for a world state was patterned on the U.S. According to Chesterton, Wells proposed, quote, "proposed almost cosmic conquest for the American Constitution," end quote, omitting, of course, the fundamental constitutional principle of decentralized, limited government. Stead's hope for exporting the Declaration of Independence, given its abstract, ahistorical, and universal claims about equality and rights, is easier to comprehend than his enthusiasm for cosmic conquests for the Constitution. Sadly, according to Stead, America's humanitarian imperialism at the turn of the century was misconstrued by some as something other than the civilizing force and benevolent dominion that it truly was. The intended beneficiaries themselves misunderstood. Imagine a worldview in which the following statement by Stead was not intended ironically. Quote, "3 years of intermittent warfare in the Philippines, waged by land and sea, have not yet induced the Filipinos to recognize the brotherly love and benevolent intentions of the invaders," end quote. In light of these regrettable circumstances, Stead welcomed Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which provided soothing relief, he said, quote, "to the uneasy conscience of men who were keen to persuade themselves that, while apparently following in the footsteps of predatory empires, they were in reality humbly accepting onerous duties imposed upon them as instruments of divine providence," end quote. Like Anglo-Saxon union, the ultimate purpose of the Americanization of the world was peace and enforced security. The dangers of imperial hubris were real, Stead warned, and the United States and Britain should therefore strive to dominate the world by ideas and by the force of example. But the risks inherent in concentrated power were worth it to Stead, because such an alliance would produce much good in the world. The goal was nothing less than the kingdom of God on earth. In March 1912, Stead received a telegram from the United States inviting him to speak at a convention at Carnegie Hall of the National Men and Religion Forward movement. The Men and Religion Forward movement was a sort of early 20th century version of Promise Keepers, intended to get men and boys back into what some saw as a dangerously feminine church. The announced topic of the event in New York was world peace. Featured speakers were to include President Taft, James Bryce, William Jennings Bryan, and Booker T. Washington. On April 10, 1912, Stead set sail on the Titanic, doomed to be one of nearly 1,500 who drowned. The man's sense of style is really quite remarkable. In a piece entitled "The Great Shipwreck as Analogy," G.K. Chesterton summed up William Stead. Quote, "The case of Mr. Stead, which I feel with a rather special emotion, both of sympathy and difference, is very typical of the whole tragedy. Mr. Stead was far too great and brave a man to require any concealment of his exaggerations or his more unbalanced moods. His strength was in a flaming certainty, which one only weakens by calling sincerity, and a hunger and thirst for human sympathy. His excess, we may say with real respect, was in the direction of megalomania, a childlike belief in big empires, big newspapers, big alliances, and big ships. He toiled like a titan for that Anglo-American combination of which the ship that has gone down may well be called the emblem. And at the last, all these big things broke about him, and somewhat bigger things remain. A courage that was entirely individual, a kindness that was entirely universal. His death may well become a legend. Many of his contemporaries, friend or foe, expected Stead's legend and legacy to continue. His early biographer devotes a brief final chapter to a consideration of Stead's place in history, wondering for which of his causes the internationally famous crusader would be best remembered, not considering for a moment the possibility that Stead would nearly vanish from our collective memory. History's ironies can be cruel. He did not live, of course, to see the catastrophe of the Great War that burst upon Europe little more than 2 years after his death. Big things, indeed, broke up all around Europe's monarchs and diplomats. But the Anglo-Saxon combination endured as one consequence of that fateful war. The United States joined with Britain. With shocking speed, Britain declined nearly to the status of an English-speaking Belgium. Those are not my words, those are Stead's words, as he feared it might. The 20th century became the American century. American culture continued to dissolve and revolutionize every other culture. And the U.S. now finds itself, if not with its flag unfurled over Istanbul, then certainly at war with Islamic terrorism. The world has been Americanized to a remarkable degree, and some speak of the nation's mission to universalize the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as birthrights given by God to all people. Some have even claimed that these efforts, especially the war in Iraq, are essential to America's spiritual health. The Americanization of the world was predicted a century ago and realized in that intervening century. But which America has been globalized? Materially, we see evidence like Coke and Levi's and popular music, too obvious to catalog. Ideologically, the American creed seems to spread outward from the nation with a soul of a church. But exactly which affirmations of the American creed are being exported, either actively or simply by example? The American creed has been a jumble of political doctrine, not entirely consistent, compatible, or coherent. As we consider the benefits and risks of the continuing Americanization of the world, benefits and risks to others and to ourselves, we have to face just which America we are talking about. We have been and continue to be many things. We have been Puritans and Cavaliers, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, Revivalists and Confessionalists, Yankees and Confederates, expansionists and isolationists, centralists and decentralists, cosmopolitans and localists, progressives and traditionalists, heterodox and orthodox, optimists and pessimists. But optimism and pessimism, to return once more to the wisdom of Chesterton, are both sins. The sins of extremes, the sins of presumption and despair. No successful empire or republic can afford to be guilty of either one. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Very, very glad to be here in this august group, and I would like to thank Gleaves and Brian and Kathy for putting this all together. This is wonderful. I want to bring this back home a little bit and talk about two figures that I consider to be important, but also in many ways forgotten, just as Stead was, but they're a little closer to home. The two I want to talk about are Paul Elmer More and Albert J. Nock, very similar and also very different. And I want to look at their response to Wilsonianism and President Wilson, sometimes logical, sometimes very passionate in their response, between about 1914 and 1919. With Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the proposed treaty to create and indeed join the League of Nations, we have, quote, a calm, arrogant, and ruthless formulation of a plan for world domination by the 5 conquering powers, a device for causing the exploitable territories of the earth to stand and deliver without the risk and the costs of war. So wrote Albert J. Nock in March of 1919. He continued, teleologically considered, we are offered an economic alliance which has as its primary object, in general, the exploitation of a propertyless dependent class the world over, and, as between nations, the exploitation of the vanquished by the victors and the weaker nations by the stronger. Indeed, for Nock, this treaty seemed to be nothing more than a new Pax Romana, but in reality, far worse than even that in ancient history. For it contemplates, he said, and inaugurates unprecedented economic war. And by throwing up trade barriers, he argued, arrogant nations would become more arrogant and weaker nations would become weaker. Pride and arrogance in the particular, he said, would replace humility, brotherhood, and the universal. Such sins, a contemporary of Knox, Paul Elmer Moore, wrote 4 years earlier in one of my favorite titles for a journal, The Unpopular Review, resulted, he said, from pure 19th century liberal arrogance. Indeed, the liberals of the 19th century had grown so enamored with the rights of men that they had forgotten that Adam and Eve had fallen and that men had more duties than he had rights. Naturally, Moore argued the modern world had embraced the Nietzschean vision. Quote, I suspect more than we are aware, we have bowed before the image of the Superman. And with such human hubris, the gods will return and strike us with all ferocity. Mars, Leviathan, and Deimos will once again become ascendant. And despite his academic and imaginative veneer, Moore worried, men such as President Woodrow Wilson had also been infected with such Nietzschean hubris. Indeed, Wilson may be the worst kind of liberal, one who plays upon the nobler imaginations of men for his own sordid purposes. I do so detest and distrust this man, Moore wrote. These arguments from only these two men offered between 1915 and 1919 what we might call a proto-form of isolationism. They are complex, generally, especially when we get into the Nietzschean arguments, and I believe that they should be handled with nuance and delicacy. For indeed, it was a diverse group of men and women, ranging from utilitarian socialists to traditional conservatives, that made up the so-called isolationists who began their fight against Wilsonian interventionism and foreign policy. And they continue. I mean, we can trace this all the way up to the present day. Men like Pat Buchanan have been called neo-isolationists, and there may be some truth in that. But certainly we can find a continuity from men like Nock and Moore all the way through from those who were fighting against Wilson, against Franklin Roosevelt, against Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, even up to Bush Jr., following that there are certain oppositions, to be sure, and we could call these isolationists, maybe. Manfred Jones, who's a very serious scholar of this matter, has written that isolation should be defined as the following: the avoidance of political and military commitments and alliances with foreign powers, but especially those in Europe. Professor Justice Dunecke prefers the term anti-interventionism. But regardless, no matter who we look at, especially in the beginning of this isolationist movement, we find that they tend to have in common their own perception, and it's a kind of collective perception of what George Washington and Alexander Hamilton had meant by avoiding entangling alliances. But I'd like to focus, as I said, on these two figures, Nock and Moore. The two men had much in common, but they also had much that was dissimilar. Of the same generation, each had been trained in a very traditional understanding of the liberal arts. Unlike our modern liberal arts programs with their disparate agendas pursuing specialized particulars and utilitarian knowledge for ultimately the sake of political and employment objectives, the old understanding of the liberal arts had embraced the 7 classical and Pauline virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, of faith, hope, and charity. It had embraced the natural law, the need for heroism, and the desire for knowledge to always be in the service of wisdom and tradition, really a glorification of the ancestors. And therefore, one can really only label these two men, Knock and Moore, as men of letters, a term that we've lost. Now we say public intellectuals, but that's something quite different from the old men of letters. When we compare those two groups, the old men of letters to the more recent public intellectuals, and this has nothing to do with left-right or conservative-liberal, I think we can say somewhat objectively that the old men of letters tended to be more dogmatic than systematic. They tended to be principled, at least according to their own lights, rather than ideological. Commensurate with their old understanding, the old Western understanding of the liberal arts, Knock and Moore each had a huge fear of 20th century mass democracy, understanding democracy, as had Plato, as nothing more than the rule of a passionate mob, as Plato explains in the Republic. Passion and democracy, of course, are fine as long as they are mixed with other things and balanced with other things. As Plato in his last book, The Laws, and Aristotle in his very famous book, The Politics, had taught, passion and democracy must be balanced with executive intellect and aristocratic imagination. Each of these men then attempted to carry on the old Western tradition of the liberal arts as professors in their respective colleges. Knock taught for quite a while at St. Stephen's College, which is now called Bard's College, and Moore spent the last 2 decades of his life teaching at Princeton as a classicist there. Additionally, each of these men had served as editors of The Nation magazine, then rooted in 19th century classical liberal as well as Burkean thought. And for The Nation, they each wrote very poignant articles of cultural, educational, and political criticism. But their differences were significant as well. Moore was always far more nuanced in his thinking and less ideological and less systematic than Knock had been. In fact, Knock could be extremely abrasive and overbearing in his own writing. Faith issues also separated the two men. While Knock ultimately lost his Anglican faith by the end of his life, we see that for someone like Paul Elmer Moore, he had embraced an Anglican faith towards the end of his life. In fact, mostly through the encouragement of his very close friend T.S. Eliot. He became an Orthodox Anglican by the 1920s, and in fact, wrote an amazing book, and I would highly recommend it for any of you, despite your own theological or lack thereof of backgrounds, a book called Pages of an Oxford Diary, which is written in the vein of St. Augustine's Confessions, and a pretty amazing autobiography. Each ultimately then, but for very different reasons, opposed Wilsonianism and wholesale interventionism and the Americanization of the world. So let us look at these two men individually, and try and figure out what they were arguing. In the broad, one may consider Albert J. Knock, along with his close friend H.L. Mencken, a 19th century classical liberal, in his cultural, political, and his religious leanings, but he always veered towards anarchy, always. He was very close to that many times in his own life. In fact, he would take these views to the extreme in the 1930s with a book against FDR entitled Our Enemy the State. And this is a very, very strange book. It is full of logical inconsistencies. It is poorly written, and unfortunately, it's the one thing that we remember Knock for. But if we go back and we look, for example, at his educational writings, they're really quite brilliant and influence such figures as Jacques Barzun. Paul Elmer Moore, along with such figures as Irving Babbitt, T.S. Eliot, Christopher Dawson, Nicholas Berdyaev, and C.S. Lewis, was a leader of the humanist movement in the first half of the 20th century. The humanists of the first half of the 20th century advocated 3 things, as well as a host of many smaller things. Number 1, they advocated a return to a traditional understanding of the liberal arts as the only proper form of education. Indeed, as they saw it, this was the only way that culture could ever be redeemed. 2, they argued for a proper understanding of the human person as neither beast nor God, flawed, but also an end in and of himself, endowed with imagination and with logos, with reason. And 3, they argued for a return to a traditional understanding of the Republic as rooted in the sacrifice of those to the common good, literally the res publica. Hence, there's a great tension there between these humanists and the 19th century liberals. For the humanists argue that we should focus much more on man's duties and much less on man's rights. The humanists were controversial, to be sure. Figures such as Albert J. Knock, whom I've just talked about, figures such as Sinclair Lewis and Edmund Wilson fought vehemently against the humanists. And one of my favorite statements comes from Dorothy Thompson, who was one of Sinclair Lewis's wives. And Dorothy Thompson, who would later gain fame by being the first non-German kicked out of Germany in 1934 because Hitler described her as the most dangerous person in the world, said once in the 1920s while having a baby, Unfortunately, during this experience, I read an article by a humanist. I much preferred giving birth to the baby. So this tells us a lot about some of the vehemence against this. And Edmund Wilson, I think, summed this up fairly when he said, dismissed More as an old-fashioned Puritan who had lost his Puritan theology but had never lost his Puritan dogmatism. Yet despite all their differences as individual persons and embracing different schools of thought, the two men, Knox and More, agreed with one another that Wilson and Wilsonianism were dangerous, perhaps gravely to the American Republic. Knox offered a sustained attack in 1915 in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly. First, he said, the advocates of peace, such as the Anti-Armament Society, with whom he definitely identified and sympathized, had already lost the battle against the war and against interventionism. Such pacifist-leaning liberals in particular assume that men are chiefly governed, at least as much or more than they actually are, by reason and logic, he said. And while the liberals make very logical arguments as to why war is irrational, illogical, horrible, and costly, the politicians who understand human nature much better are constantly appealing to the passions of men. But really, Knox wrote, men are very little governed by reason and logic. And this accounts for the fact that in an issue between a philosopher and a politician, the politician always wins. Edmund Burke had said something similar, that whenever the professor plays politics, he always comes out the ass. The average man, especially if uneducated and lower middle class, Knox continued, sees war as a great equalizer, an adventure to make him the equal of any member of society. The regimentation, the marching, the parade, the drill. Here are men with their individuality fully expanded and preserved, and yet each with his primary thought continually reaching beyond himself, each consciously responsible for the perfection of alignment towards a common goal. Such progress, not continued in a war, will lead ultimately to the full collectivization of all of society. War then does nothing more than distort the virtues of loyalty and responsibility. It centralizes all things, and ultimately, Knox said in very romantic language, man becomes nothing more than a mere cog in a vast machine. Continuing his argumentation, in the introduction to an anonymous book, it was written by a British statesman, How Diplomats Make War, Knox made his second argument against American intervention. War only, ultimately, he says, aids the elites. Despite what the common man may hope or believe, with whom should Americans sympathize? This question was asked frequently in 1914 and 1915. Should they sympathize with the peoples of Britain and France or the peoples of Germany? To this, Knox said, neither, for this is a false question. It is never with the people, for that is a mere pretense, he argued, but always with the office holders and the machinations of a baker's dozen of men who, by deviltry and compromise and all the devious ways of the professional statesman, get into office and they make up the governments. Let us be perfectly clear about this. Every bid for our sympathy since the war began means only sympathy with certain policies of politicians and bureaucrats and their satellite hellions who are distributed throughout the embassies of the world. Indeed, he says, political 20th century liberalism, as represented by Woodrow Wilson, as opposed to what he considered to be great 19th century classical liberalism, had become nothing but empty platitudes spoken by opportunistic men. We are sick of sham and sop, of guff and sanctimony, about liberty and humanity and decency and God and democracy and all the rest. We want to know something about the men who are behind this sort of talk and what they have been doing to make their professions good. If one holds loyalty to America, he should not confuse that to loyalty to an office or to a bureaucrat. For what is a nation? No one can defend a nation, Knox says. That is a mere abstraction. One can only defend a farm, a family, or something tangible. Knox then concluded his argument by saying, ultimately, we should just nationalize. Now, this is a man who's a pretty serious free market libertarian. Ultimately, we should just nationalize all of the armaments industry. Once that was done, and if we paid for them with a small tax on incomes and inheritance, Americans would never again hear a word about preparedness. It would be over, and there would be no war. War, by its very nature, not continued, only increases the size and power and possibilities of office holders and bureaucrats. Further, he argued, what do we see in this present war? And now he's writing later into the war itself by 1917. What do we see? A pure attack on all civil liberties. This, of course, has been demonstrated in Paul Murphy's wonderful book, World War I and the Origin of Civil Liberties in the United States. There can be really little doubt as to the severity of civil rights and civil liberties abuses. Knock writes in his letter, in a private letter, "Can't you think of something new? Something that will work? You always come off like a Puritan. You scare a man, and he turns instantly to the thought of force majeure, and then you put a tax of all things on the enemy's language. I don't like German. In fact, I think there's nothing good that's ever been written in German, even though it's been in good use for a long while, and it will continue to be so after you and I are gone. In fact, I can further say that there's a good deal of it being spoken in the kingdom of heaven at this moment. And believe me, if the blessed saints and apostles can stand listening to it, so can the good citizens of Boston." So ultimately then, Knock believed very strongly that government simply didn't have the right to go to war, and certainly not to speak in terms of fighting for a people. It could only fight for offices, for policies, and so forth. What about Paul Elmer More? He argued ultimately that World War I was a punishment by the gods for our 19th century liberal arrogance. 19th century liberal man had forgotten how utterly flawed the human soul could be, and he attempted to hide and destroy all remnants of such superstitions as Judaism and Christianity. Now, it used to be, he wrote, the belief of an ancient people, superstitious, you may call them if you so choose, yet one of the great promoters of civilization, that the invisible powers behind things we see were wont to observe the thoughts and actions of mankind with a watchful jealousy, and were particularly quick to avenge those who from arrogance or folly forgot, as the saying was, to realize that they are mere mortals. Upon the minds of such men, they sent a nemesis in the form of madness and dazed bewilderment. And to one listening today in the language of the press and the street, it might almost seem as if the avenging gods were not dead. For disaster has been brought upon the world, not by the sober minority of learned and civilized Western men, More argued, but by the ideologues who seem to have gained the ear of the multitudes. Indeed, he continues, since the rise of a Karl Marx and a Charles Darwin, all culminating, he argued, in Friedrich Nietzsche, the Western world has been suspended between Manichaean extremes, the traditionalist who finds meaning in the past and the ideologue who dreams of a perfect future. Marx had believed man as merely economic, Darwin as merely biological, and Nietzsche as nothing more than a pure waste of material. Had there been any real progress with all of these so-called great thoughts, More rhetorically asked? Had man really improved his soul, his condition in the 19th century? Had he bettered the world and himself? Had he perfected his soul? Had he grown out of his adolescent faith? No, of course not, More answered. The attempt at progress had only led to regress and moral decadence. And such moral decadence, diabolically, had now, in World War I, made an alliance with technological prowess. The imagination, he wrote, is excited by the devilishness of all this new machinery of death, by the power of the guns, the insidious terror of craft that smites inhumanely, under the cover of water and drops destruction from the clouds themselves. We have never known these things before, and it is almost as if it were in the position of a too cunning Frankenstein, shuddering at the demon that he had created from his own ruin. Though the English and the French had absolutely no right to hold themselves aloof from this, that is, they could not excuse themselves from this mixing of moral decadence and technological prowess, it was, he said, the Germans who had seemingly perfected Frankenstein's monster. Above all, it is in Germany that socialism has fattened and grown strong and reared itself as the logical and organized enemy of economic and military competition, More wrote. There are in many parts of England, France, and America a vague humanitarianism, which More always defined as a perverted form of charity, that had led to the swelling reverence for the word people, as opposed to such good terms as character and education. Such false teachings only exacerbated the poorest tendencies and vice-filled longings of man, for he would become nothing more than puffed up with himself. The preaching of such an exaggerated humanitarianism inflames the people and renders them yet even more efficient, he wrote. The individual person becomes lost in a mass of conformity, and this, More argued, becomes dangerous for two very important reasons. First, it dehumanizes the person, again using the same romantic language as had Knock, making him a mere cog in a vast, uncontrollable machine. And second, it destroys that which makes us most human, the ability to imagine possibilities, the ability to see beyond ourselves, to see the goodness in another. Wilson's understanding and perversion of imagination angered more than anything else. I have always disliked various politicians, he wrote in a private letter, Roosevelt, for instance, but I have never felt towards any man, not even Bryan, as I do towards Wilson. He has certain qualities which appeal to the intelligence of men otherwise clear-sighted and straightforward, and as a consequence, he seems to have corrupted the nation from the very top and lowered our entire mental and moral tone. This he wrote on February 25th of 1917. Only a year and a half later, he again struck at Wilson. Wilson's sentimentalism was not a true ideal and was likely to be an important element in the horrible spread of Bolshevism that now threatens the world. For a man in Wilson's position to say, and insisted as one of the terms of peace, that all peoples have a right of determining their own governments, strikes me as nonsense, and perilous nonsense at that. It is impracticable, the sort of sentimentalism that does not conform with fact or reality, yet may be the cause of endless confusion and anarchy. And this is the sort of thing that underlies all of Wilsonian humanitarianism. In essence, according to Moore, Wilson was not a man. He had failed the Republic. He had failed the citizens of the Republic. And ultimately, he will fail the world because he put ideology above imagination. Moore refused the term isolationist or pacifist, claiming that both of these were mere ideological terms. He said, however, publicly in January of 1915 that any nation that goes to war must do two things first. First, a people must always set its own house in order. For, he wrote, before the gate of paradise from which we have been ejected are flaming swords of the two avenging angels, inexorable, whether we call them the nemesis of the gods or simply the natural law. Second, every society must always pursue justice, for justice is nothing but the balance within a man's own soul, self-imposed and self-sustained, the will to know clearly the middle truth between the philosophy of egotism, which declares that it is for the strong and prudent to take whatever they desire, and the contrary philosophy of egalitarian sympathy. Well, when we sum this up and in conclusion, we can obviously see that neither Knock nor Moore ever created any kind of permanent school of thought. Each contributed significantly to what would become known later as the isolationist movement. And this movement, also as noted earlier, was profoundly, if not radically, diverse in its membership and in its argumentation. In this brief talk, I have focused on two figures. One, a classical liberal who bordered on being an anarchist, the other, a Christian humanist and a very serious traditionalist, both at the beginning of this anti-Wilsonianism, and to draw us together into some similarities, or at least draw us to some similarities and dissimilarities in this movement. But regardless of our own 21st century views, emotions, and agendas, we can say with certainty that these two men, both of whom knew very well their Greek and their Roman history, both of whom knew that there would always be a tension between a republic and an empire, and both of whom, in their own very different and sometimes odd ways, fought for the dignity of the human person, had with some justice the right to agree, at least in 1919, and perhaps even in 2005, to argue with Marcus Cicero, the greatest of all Republicans in the history of the world. And I quote from the very end of the Republic, small r Republican, very end of the Republic from Cicero. He quotes first from a poem, and then he comments on it. The Commonwealth of Rome is founded firm on ancient customs and on men of might. Our poet seems to have obtained these words so brief and so true from an oracle. For neither men alone, unless a state is supplied with customs, nor customs alone, unless we have been men enough to defend them, could ever have been sufficient to found or to preserve a republic, whose dominion extends so far and so wide. And thus, before our own time, the customs of our ancestors produced excellent men. And eminent men preserved our ancient customs and the institutions of our forefathers. But though the republic, when it came to us, was like a beautiful painting, whose colors were already fading with age, our own time has not only neglected to freshen it by renewing the original colors, it has not even taken the trouble to preserve its configuration and to speak of its general outlines. For what is now left of the ancient customs on which he said the Commonwealth of Rome was founded firm? They have been, as we see, so completely buried in oblivion that they are not only no longer practiced, but they are already completely forgotten. And what shall I say of the men? For the loss of our customs is due to our lack of men. And of this great evil we must not only give an account, but must even defend ourselves in every way possible, as if we had been accused of murder. For it is through our own faults, not by any accident, that we retain only the form of the Commonwealth, but have long since lost its essence. Thank you very much.
We've got time for a few questions. If any of you have them.
What did Woodrow Wilson ever do to him?
Was that General Bunting? I can't see from here. There was, of course, they had both been at Princeton, and there really,
Well, that explains
that does explain a lot, yeah. When you go back and look at Wilson's earlier writings, he had really written as a Burkean. I mean, he was a very strong Burkean, and of course More was as well. And you can really trace a long tradition, very long. I mean, we could start with Plato, go up through Cicero to St. Augustine, all the way forward to Edmund Burke. And that was the tradition that both Wilson and More had originally seen themselves in. But of course, Wilson, when he got into politics, had really changed his tune. And many people thought, many critics of Wilson had thought that he had, the executive power had gone to his head. And that just was not permissible in a republic as they saw it. So that's, it does sound very personal, doesn't it, General? But it probably is.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Carl Wally. I have a question. I've been pondering it since really the second panel. It has to do with two American traditions, mixed enlightenment, mixed religion. One might be the notion of the exemplary republic, which spreads revolution around the world to what we today call soft power, by getting people to imitate those parts of our example which they find genial, and is an argument against intervention in trying to foment change in other parts of the world. And the other one is much more in the spirit of the really tough Christians, Cromwell and such, who knock heads. And now that we get to the period you're at, it doesn't seem so clear to me anymore. What role is the U.S. serving in the world now? Is it an exemplary republic, or is it a forceful republic that is liberating people? Is President Bush in which of these traditions is the current president? At any rate, it seems to me that confronting those two traditions directly and both their advantages and disadvantages may be appropriate.
All I would be able to do is just keep stretching your question out and out and out. I mean, this is what I puzzle through, because you watch how the strands keep weaving around each other in American history, and one predominates at one time and one at another. I mean, the American identity, how it thinks of itself and of its role in the world, whether it's going to be merely as example or guarantor of liberty and exporter and all that. I mean, it becomes this increasingly complex combination of ideas, whether it's Enlightenment or Puritan revolutionary or romantic manifest destiny. Then you add in Darwinism. Then, you add in these deterministic strands later on, which is a strong part of Stead, by the way, too. In a larger paper, I have a whole section on his kind of pop Darwinism that he throws into this mix as well. I don't know how to sort all that out. In some ways it becomes more complex, but in other ways too, it becomes simplified because the pieces get reduced down to just these fragments of metaphors and stuff that just don't even work together anymore. And it doesn't even seem to carry, to me, to my ears, it doesn't seem to carry a real conviction anymore. It's just this vocabulary. And I wonder how long that vocabulary can just go on and make any kind of compelling case. But I don't know what
I
others
think
think.
that vocabulary has been going on for 200 plus years, even more than that if you go back to the British and to the English. I think there's an American interest these days, particularly popular interest in the media, on resolving this one way or the other, when I think one of the things that's dynamic about the United States is the constant negotiation between the two. I mean, from the very beginning of the Republic, you have these great statements about what you would call soft power, the Declaration of Independence, common sense, Thomas Paine saying the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. And he doesn't exactly mean the same thing George Bush means, but there's something there. And yet, in order to secure that liberty, you have to have an army. You have to create a government. You have to tax. You have to have a bureaucracy. And you have to protect yourself nationally in terms of security. I don't see how you can have one without the other. And I don't quite always understand why Americans want us to choose one way or the other. Fred Anderson and I have written this book, as was mentioned, the subtitle of which is Empire and Liberty in North America. And yet constantly people will say, which one is it, empire or liberty? And you know, it's almost as if in some ways, particular radio talk show hosts can't get their head around the idea that the two could actually be in constant conversation with each other in different manifestations over the course of 2.5 centuries.
I agree with that, but I would suggest that there actually is a distinction. I've thought about this for a while, and if I might advertise some of my own work, I wrote a book called What America Owes the World, which gets at this question of whether America is an exemplary republic, or the term that I use for the Cromwellian version is a vindicator republic. Does it go out actually and vindicate the right by force? And you see this theme from the very beginning. I think we will see it again, because on particular points, on particular issues, you do choose. So, for example, in the current context, the United States could decide that the way to encourage democracy in the Middle East is to send American troops to Iraq and start from there, try to expand outward. Another way of proposing it would be to take the John Quincy Adams approach and say the way to convince the world is to get democracy right at home. And then the example of the United States will spread. Now, I have a hunch that although we're in the Cromwellian vindicationist mode at the moment, trying to impose democracy by American force, it won't be too long before we see a backlash against it. I'm assuming things don't undertake a remarkable turnaround. I think we're at the stage, essentially, that we were in the Vietnam War in 1966 or 1967, when the United States was trying to do the same thing. And by the early 1970s, George McGovern was saying, "Come home, America," which was basically saying, okay, we tried to impose democracy by force. It didn't work. Let's come home and get our act together at home. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the same thing after another year or two in Iraq, maybe in time for the 2006 election, maybe 2008. But I think these are two versions of American exceptionalism. We've got this lesson for the world. Will the lesson sustain itself, or does it need the help of force?
I think it's worth pointing out, too, if I can just jump in there, that it's rare for an empire to say, you know, we're going to take over the world and expand dominion just because we're mean and nasty. I mean, most people, I mean, the idea that America has a mission and all this other kind of stuff, I don't think is particularly unique. But the point I wanted to make in response to this was, I think one of the interesting things about American history is the degree to which you see domestic social change that comes during or on the heels of serious uses of military power. It's no coincidence that it's usually a war that focuses this debate in some kind of serious way, and you go through periods of what look like repression, Lincoln, Wilson, the Patriot Act, or whatever it might be. And yet, without predicting history at all, it's also true that that usually focuses some kind of national public debate that in many cases has resulted in the most expansive moments in citizenship in the history of the United States flow directly out of people trying to come to terms with, negotiating that relationship between power and liberty.
I would only add, this is not my area. The closer we get to the present time, I will plead ignorance. I like to hide in the past. But you know, when
That's
we
why we're
think about
historians.
that's right. I mean, when we think about the 20th century in particular, again, this is out of my area, but we look at the language of Truman all the way to Nixon, and it's always about realpolitik. And then you get to Carter, and if we can just forget politics for a moment, because I'm going to put Carter and Reagan in the same category. The interesting thing about their rhetoric is how, in the best sense, humanitarian it becomes and how transcendent that language is. My oldest brother graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 1981, and I got to see Reagan. I was only 13. But I got to see Reagan's first speech after the assassination attempt and his first public appearance. And if you remember, this is a very famous lecture that he gave where he said the West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. And he was right. I mean, everyone thought he was a fool, and we may disagree with every one of his other policies, but there was something spectacular about Reagan's language, which he used again in 82, in 83, and 87 when he challenged Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And American reporters and scholars were scoffing at him, but Eastern Europeans were taking this to heart. And there's something very interesting about this in the sense of what you were talking about, Carl, because clearly this is more the idealistic mode of speaking. And even though Reagan armed us to the teeth, at the same time his rhetoric was very different from realpolitik. And Carter as well, in saying that we have to have a foreign policy based on the dignity of the human person. That could have come straight from the Vatican. It's interesting language in the way that it's being used.
We had one question in the back, and I think we'll maybe end it with that. Yes, sir. Oh, well, we'll get two. Yeah, I mean, you in the back first, and then you.
As you will tell from my accent, I'm also not from southern Michigan. I am from Puerto Rico, so I am a living, walking relic, byproduct of the Spanish-American War. So if you think you have a hard time figuring out these two dynamos, go to Puerto Rico and see how they try to deal with this. It was earlier mentioned that differences in vocabulary and concepts with the Mexican view of the Mexican-American War, and this is also happening in Puerto Rico. If you look at the very early documents, letters, negotiations between
thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I mean,
History lives. Yes, sir. Could you speak up a little bit, or do we have a microphone?
It's not working.
Oh.
At its heart, imperialism, empire, involves intervention by one state into the affairs of others, either directly by military force, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, economically, as probably we involve ourselves in Central America, or culturally, as the American entertainment industry has spread out over the world and influenced the cultures of the other countries. Now, in order to judge the validity or not intervention by one state into the affairs of another state, however it's done, you have to know what sovereignty is. As I understand it, sovereignty concept is 3.5 centuries old in fact Australia, imposed by positive agreement of a number of states, or at least a number of governments, in whatever form they were in, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, whatever, they agreed that government, that state would be sovereign, free from interference by some other. Now, today, we have interference, intrusion into other states' affairs by non-governmental organizations, Islamic terrorism, but also by business, all by business, has revenues that are greater than, I can tell you what the numbers are, but I understand it's a third to a half of the other of the countries of the world. Is it time, in light of those changed circumstances, to reconsider what sovereignty means, what protections it gives the state, and what rights other states or other non-governmental organizations have to intrude into another state?
For what it's worth, we already are. The world already is, so that American law extends to foreign countries. Manuel Noriega was indicted and ultimately prosecuted for crimes committed on Panamanian soil. This kind of extraterritoriality is relatively new. Henry Kissinger doesn't travel to Britain for fear that he's going to be indicted and prosecuted for war crimes. So these notions of sovereignty are changing. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the received notions of sovereignty arose at a time when the physical coercive power of a country was more or less coexistent with its territory. Now power exists far beyond boundaries, and so whether the UN or anybody else catches up, or international law catches up with it, in fact, we are living in this new reality. And maybe we historians are the last ones to get the message. Maybe the political scientists will be a little bit ahead of us. But the world will change whether we acknowledge it or not. Well, now,
no, I mean, you're asking historians, and so what we're going to tell you is who knows what's going to happen. I mean, by what your question said, and I think there's a lot of truth to what you say, the whole notion of sovereignty is historically constructed, and therefore it evolves. I mean, notions like the end of history, for example, just sound utterly silly to me, because
any historian.
we have a presumption somehow or another that where we are right now is somehow fixed, and it's going to change. It is changing, and I think often what happens with human societies, humans period, is we aren't fully aware of the ramifications of those changes and deal with them culturally or institutionally or legally until they've already taken place on some level. And that's part of what we call a revolution, or something is all about, is the recognition that the world is a different kind of place. I agree, sovereignty is changing, has changed drastically, and in some ways our thinking about it is running behind the way in which governments and other people are already beginning to behave.
And you mentioned the words legitimacy and validity, and those are almost connoted by sovereignty. I from the standpoint of the historian, I often ask myself, what does legitimacy have to do with anything? These things happen, and frankly, I think they will happen based on who has the power. I happen to think that these questions of legitimacy come in after the fact. If you've got the power, you figure out ways to declare legitimate what you want to do. And rarely does legitimacy precede decisions. It follows after decisions made by power. But that's just my view of things. Cleves, do we have any final announcements or anything we need to do?
I hope anybody here can come to the lecture tonight that you will be giving at 8 o'clock over at the Gerald R. Ford Museum. Bill Brand will be talking about his new book on Andrew Jackson, which is hot off the press. You'll have an opportunity to have the book signed. Hope you can come join us. 8 o'clock, Gerald R. Ford.
Very good. Well, thanks to one and all.
Great.
Thank you. Very good job.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Both of those papers were wonderfully delivered.